Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of something you have wanted for a very long time, a relationship that finally feels safe, a version of work that actually means something, a quiet sense of your own life opening, and then, without quite deciding to, you let it go. This is the struggle you already know, the one that lives just beneath the language you use to explain yourself, the pattern of reaching and then retreating, of building something real, and then, in some moment you can barely trace afterward, dismantling it. And self-sabotage isn't merely failure or weakness or some character flaw you inherited from a difficult season, but something far more precise, a slow releasing, like a hand opening around a fistful of sand, where the tighter the grip, the faster the grains pour through, and what is lost cannot even be named as it goes. What if the thing slipping through your fingers isn't just opportunity, but something that was always yours to keep? And what if the letting go you can never quite explain afterward isn't a failure of will at all, but a choice being made somewhere just beneath your awareness? There are 4 specific things you surrender every time this pattern runs, and by the end of this journey, you'll not only be able to name each one with a clarity that changes how you see your own history. The final revelation is perhaps the most quietly devastating of all. There's a concept in Jungian psychology so precise, so quietly devastating in its implications that once you encounter it, the random feeling chaos of self-sabotage stops looking random at all. Jung called it the shadow, not a metaphor for evil, not a poetic name for your worst impulses, but a specific psychological structure, the part of the psyche that holds everything you have ever deemed unacceptable about yourself and buried out of conscious sight. Jung wrote that the shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors. This means that what lives in your shadow is not simply the darkness you fear. It is the wholeness you abandoned, the parts of yourself that were too wild, too tender, too ambitious, or too needy to survive the terms of your early belonging. The shadow is not a villain lurking beneath your better self. It is a keeper, holding under pressure precisely what was never allowed to breathe. There is a moment you have lived before, perhaps more than once, perhaps so many times that some quiet part of you has stopped being surprised by it. The relationship has finally settled into something real, something warm and reciprocal. And then you find yourself picking the exact fight you swore you would never pick again. The project you have worked toward for months is close enough to touch, and suddenly your attention scatters, your energy drains, and the thing you wanted most becomes the thing you can least bring yourself to approach. The body feels strong for the first time in years, and almost without deciding to, you reach for the thing that will undo it. You watch yourself do this. And the watching is its own particular anguish, because you are not unconscious in these moments. You are entirely present, clear-eyed, somehow both the person pulling the emergency brake and the person who can see exactly what is being lost. What is it, then, that makes the arrival of good things feel so much like danger? And why would some part of you, watching all of it clearly, choose the very moment of safety to reach for the brake? What you have just recognized, the moment you saw yourself in those scenes, the fight picked, the retreat made, the threshold abandoned, is real. And it matters. But recognition alone is only the outermost ring of what is actually happening beneath the surface of your behavior. The pattern has a structure, a logic as precise and as mappable as any architecture, and that structure is what explains why the sabotage returns even after you have named it, even after you have promised yourself otherwise, even after you understand it intellectually and watch it happen anyway. What is the mechanism underneath it? And why does simply knowing about it change so little until you go deeper into the way it is built? The most illuminating territory is still to come. Stay with us as we descend beneath the behavior itself and into the exact machinery driving every act of self-surrender. Here, then, is the mechanism that was promised, and it is stranger and more intimate than you might have expected. Jung observed that everything the ego refuses to claim does not simply disappear. It migrates, It finds a host in the world outside, settles into the face of a colleague, a partner, a stranger on the street, and stares back at you wearing someone else's expression. He wrote that, "The carrier of a projection is not chosen by chance," and this means that the people who provoke the sharpest reactions in you, the ones who enrage you or fascinate you beyond any reasonable proportion, are holding something that belongs to you, something you handed to them without knowing you had made the transfer. Think of the psyche in these moments as a projector loaded with your own film, casting its images onto every wall around you. The room fills with pictures that feel entirely external, entirely about other people. But the film was always yours, threaded through the machine before you ever entered the space. Narcissus did not fall in love with the pool, he fell in love with himself and called it the world. When you self-sabotage, you are often protecting this projection, because to stop projecting would mean taking back what you gave away and owning it fully. Here, then, is the answer to what you recognized in those earlier scenes. The reason good things so reliably trigger the retreat, the reason the threshold itself becomes the danger. Jung put it precisely. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. In other words, the capacities you never permitted yourself to claim do not vanish. They accumulate in the shadow, pressing against the boundary of what you have decided you are allowed to be, and eventually they assert themselves as disruption rather than development. So when a relationship reaches genuine health, or a creative project begins to attract real attention, or a career finally lifts toward what you once imagined from a distance, the sabotage that arrives is not irrational fear of failure. It is something older and more precise than that. It is the shadow reclaiming the potential it has been holding in suspension, the unlived version of you pushing back against a life that still has not made room for it. The very goodness of the moment becomes the pressure that breaks the seal. What gets surrendered here is not just the opportunity. It is the unlived self that the opportunity was calling forward. The third thing you surrender is perhaps the most intimate of all. Not a quality projected outward, not a potential frozen at the threshold, but something closer. The quiet interior voice that actually knows what you want, what you value, what direction feels genuinely yours. Jung described the persona, the mask the psyche constructs for social survival, as a necessary adaptation, but one that grows dangerous when it is mistaken for the self entire. This means that over time, the survival strategies you built to remain safe, loved, or acceptable can harden into a second identity that speaks louder than anything underneath it. And self-sabotage is, among other things, the moment that persona defends its authority. When you retreat from something that truly calls you, when the more authentic choice arrives and you find reasons, suddenly, not to take it, you are hearing the survival voice drown out the deeper one. How often do you sense what you actually want, only to find that want buried almost before it fully forms? And when it resurfaces, wearing different clothes in a different year, do you recognize it as the same knowing you silenced before? 3 of the 4 things you give away through self-sabotage have now come into the light. Your disowned qualities projected onto others, the unlived potential frozen at every threshold you approached and retreated from, the authentic self, slowly obscured beneath the survival persona's insistence that it knows better. And yet the 4th remains, the one that operates so quietly, so continuously, that most people never think to name it as a loss at all. What is it that slips away, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated weight of every cycle repeated? And how much of it is already gone while you were busy calling the pattern a bad habit? The most devastating gift is still to come. Stay with us as we enter the territory where the cost of self-sabotage becomes not a feeling, but a fact you can no longer look away from. There is a 4th thing, and it is the one the other 3 have been quietly stealing all along. Not a quality, not a capacity, not a voice, but the irreplaceable medium in which all of those things either come alive or don't. What you give away through every cycle of sabotage, escape, and shame. Soaked return is lived time, not hours in the abstract sense, but the actual seasons of your one life, the specific mornings and years in which you might have become more fully yourself and instead became fluent only in retreat. Think of time as a river flowing through a landscape you keep turning your back on. You can hear it behind you the entire time, its sound constant and close, and when you finally turn around, a stretch of it has already passed beyond the bend and will not return. No amount of integration, however genuine, recovers what moved through while your back was turned. This is what the four surrendered things finally reveal, held together. It was never only your qualities, your potential, or your authentic voice that the shadow consumed. It was the living seasons in which those things were meant to matter. Integration is not the shadow's defeat. It is something quieter and paradoxically more demanding than that. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This means that the work is not about replacing what is difficult in you with something easier, but about learning to see it clearly, to hold it, to stop flinching from what it reveals. And when that relationship with the shadow begins to form, genuinely, not merely intellectually, something shifts in the texture of ordinary days in ways you may not immediately name, but will unmistakably feel. Projection loosens its grip, and the person who used to enrage you becomes simply a person carrying their own story, no longer a mirror held up to the parts of yourself you had not yet claimed. Unlived potential, which self-sabotage had kept frozen at the threshold, begins to press forward with a kind of quiet insistence, not as ambition exactly, but as orientation, a sense of knowing which direction is yours. The authentic self, no longer continuously overridden by the survival persona's reflexes, starts to speak in a register you recognize as true. And time, that fourth surrendered thing, begins to feel inhabited rather than consumed, each day less a repetition of the old cycle and more an actual life, moving in a direction you chose. There is a particular kind of trap that opens precisely here, in this moment of understanding, because the mind, having grasped something true and difficult, can quietly mistake the grasping for the arrival. You can hold the idea of integration the way you hold a photograph of a place you have never visited, and the photograph, however accurate, changes nothing about where you actually live. The most revealing territory is still to come. Stay with us as we move from understanding what was surrendered into the lived daily practice of beginning to take it back. The first practical movement into integration is not a procedure. It is a posture, a quality of attention you bring to the moment the pattern begins to move in you before it has fully taken shape. This is close to what Jung called active imagination, not analysis from a safe distance, but a deliberate waking encounter with the part of you that has been kept out of sight. In practice, it means pausing at the exact threshold where the familiar pull begins, the procrastination settling in, the argument gathering in your chest, the retreat from the thing that mattered, and meeting it with genuine curiosity rather than self-accusation. What is actually happening here? And what is this impulse, underneath all of it, trying to protect? Imagine sitting across a table from a guest who has been knocking at the back door for years, not to invite chaos in, but to finally hear what they have been trying to say. The guest is not your enemy. The guest is the part of you that found no other language than disruption. When you turn toward the sabotaging impulse with that quality of honest, unhurried attention, when you treat it as a messenger carrying information about what was never safe to want, the pattern loses the authority it held in silence. When projection begins to quiet, when you stop needing the people closest to you to carry the weight of what you haven't yet claimed in yourself, something in relationships shifts at a level almost too subtle to name at first. The person across from you stops being a screen onto which old fears are cast and becomes, perhaps for the first time, genuinely visible to you. How often have you looked at someone you loved and seen, underneath the looking, only a reflection of your own unresolved interior? And when you finally stopped, what opened between you that the distance had been filling? In creative life, the change is equally quiet and equally profound. Reclaimed potential doesn't announce itself loudly. It simply begins moving toward expression, not forced, not performed, but following the actual contour of what the authentic self has always wanted to make. And freed time no longer feels managed or rationed but inhabited, the way a room feels different when you finally decide to live in it rather than pass through. What begins to return in relationships and in creative life is real. And yet even this is not the whole of what integration offers. There's a deeper turn beneath all four of the things you have been reclaiming, one that reframes the entire journey you thought you were on. The most quietly transforming realization is still to come. Stay with us as we gather the four threads into the single truth they were always pointing toward. And here, at last, is the revelation that was promised at the very beginning of this journey, the one that perhaps shifts everything you thought you understood about what you were trying to recover. It was never about retrieving four separate things, as though wholeness were a list of possessions scattered across different rooms. The projection, the unlived potential, the authentic self, the irreplaceable time. These were never truly separate losses. They were one loss wearing four faces. They were the single act of fracturing, repeated across every domain of your life, every time the shadow was refused a seat at the table. What integration restores, beneath all of it, is not a better version of you. It is the end of the division itself, the quiet, radical cessation of the war between what you are and what you have been willing to be seen as. And when that war ends, something unexpected happens. You do not arrive somewhere new. You discover you are already standing on ground that was always there, waiting beneath the struggle, solid, unglamorous, and entirely yours. Wholeness, it turns out, is not a destination. It is the ground you were always trying to find your footing on. I invite you to share your thoughts, your reflections, and your questions. What has this exploration revealed to you? And what, if you let yourself sit with it honestly, has it named that some part of you already knew? Thanks for looking.